Nation Records, 360 Army, Rastafari. You already know what time it is. Time to redeem the time. Praise up that shit back. Living in the world full of zombies, they walking dead. Dumb, deaf, and blind Gentile Babylonians. I and I have been quickened, redeemed by the Most High, filled with His Spirit. In the new name I walk now. Talmud Rastafari, Selassie on top now. I reap and I sow good fruit. Trample Babylon under I tremble and boot. Fast and pray, idle liberty. Negus, Neges, Selassie, Rastafari. Study in the Holy Scripture, learn the half of the story that they failed to reveal to us. Babylon resistance is useless. Rastafari remain the crown holder regardless. Label me a conscious artist because I remain in the truth and in who's in control of all of this. As we walk and stumble through these valleys and these shadows, must remain focused on the spiritual battle. Led like sheep to the slaughter like cattle, never realizing that you're a divine animal. Imagine if everything you thought became tangible, your hardships manageable. We living with the sickness and Jah is the antidote. Prescriptions and scriptures, words, sound, power, Rastafari.
Alright, so again, here, Shalom and Salam Ta, Lidj, Yefdi, Yefdeyah, Yohannes, Wolde, Amanuel, RastafariRenaissance.com. And again, be sure to check all of our podcasts out there for the Rastafari Foundation and the gathering site there at blogtalkradiocom, there for Discipleship Radio. So again, just coming to you again in this video to really get into more detail about a lot of Rastafari, especially in the sense in connection with the kingdom. Not coming to the eye mostly in the sense of the best location, not in my usual location where I usually record videos, but of course we'll still come forward in the best manner as possible. But and again, just forgive I for not posting more frequently, as we really have a lot of vids still to post from the past couple of sevens, or the past couple of weeks, past couple of shabuos, or some in Tawim. But again, the object lesson here of this vid is more so to dispel a lot of the confusion and misdirection about much of the titles and ranks that are, of course, affinity leaning and more in the sense of the imperial crown, so to speak, of Ethiopia more specifically. But again, we mention this because it's really come to the time in which we should more so study these things more in depth to get a, of course, holistic perspective of these titles, and in so much as in concordance with our names, of course, our new names, even so from scripture speaking. But even with that, scripture aside, just getting to the governmental and of course more critical standpoints of recognizing not only the culture but the historical standpoint of a lot of what we see as true and forthright. So again, we reference just the Imperial Crown Council of Ethiopia. Of course, they're headed up by Li'ul Ras Armis Sahle Selassie, or the great-grandson of Haile Selassie I. Of course, bloodline prince, very active on the political, and social stage, especially with Ethiopia in exile as far as the imperial crown goes. But here, just referencing again, Ethiopia Mikarbeit, or the Crown Council of Ethiopia site and the organization. They're headed up by our prince of the bloodline. I had to really dispel a lot of the information that has gone out from such a time at this point. to really give one's a true perspective on the sense of what Rastafari entails as far as a movement, as far as a spiritual conviction, in as so much as what ones would know as a livity, and as far as that point as the movement is concerned. Now, really, in a sense, it really goes to the point to show that, here, even so in the West, and not only specifically speaking of North America or the Western Hemisphere in that sense, but the Western Hemisphere as a whole, as it is that Rastafari, the movement, was started by those of the Caribbean peoples, and well, not even so started, but more so, brought to its prominence from those ones there in the movement in the Caribbean, in Jamaica specifically, where we're speaking of, but not only, of Jamaica, those in Trinidad and Tobago and Montserrat, other places like that of that nature, Dominica, and we can go on and on about that. But, just to stick to the point here, it goes to show a lot about, being linguistically handicapped, as so spoken by a Rebbe and a teacher and a brethren, more specifically speaking, Stefari there of Rastafari Sabbatical in the line of Judah Society, also Rastafari Foundation as well. But, just bringing that to the forefront and showing that a lot of the language and the linguistics, plays such a heavy role in bringing about the entirety of one's understanding of their history, culture, and so on and so forth, language in that sense. And it really shows, that ones have been lackluster on certain instances, but, sometimes to the detriment of their own doing, and sometimes just in, pure infantile ignorance. So it not to say ignorance as though we're denigrating ones, but, as the definition goes of ignorance of one who really just doesn't know, doesn't have a knowledge. So, you're unaware, more so to speak, and that's a better rendition and a better definition to speak there. So of ignorance, if one is ignorant, one just, just doesn't have the knowledge of certain things to present or a specific topic that's being brought out. But just to, continue with that, this is what, I found from my own, independent study, to say the least, and just to segue for a moment, just showing the importance of language. We look at one's, specifically of the Spanish-speaking community. So just to take that for, instance or an example, when one has the ability to become multilingual in this sense of the world and how things are going, especially on a geopolitical stage and economic stage, you really are set in an advantage to where you can actually have a grasp and also an understanding of not only one language and one manner of speech, but you are able to translate, transliterate, understand, overstand, so on and so forth, in the manners of another language. And this plays a heavy role, a lot, even so in the mentality, because not only are you able to find ways to dibble and dabble or to become fluent in multiple languages, but you're able to interpret, even if it's so just from your own perspective, you're able to interpret two manners of thinking. Because sometimes one's might even take it so the sense of, well, one is just translating this language to this and that and so on and so forth. These are the things that you might hear out in the world. But, when you really get to the crux of the matters in which a lot of languages are being interpreted or translated or transliterated, you really find that there's more to the surface than meets the eye, just so, proverbially speaking. And we so find that in so many manners, not only, specifically speaking of the Amharic language, but as we mentioned, we'll use the Spanish-speaking peoples and, those of our, Latino or Ladino ancestry in that sense, since it's very specific to this geographical location, especially here in the Western Hemisphere or North America. What you find in that is a lot of the interpretations, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the, I guess you can say, interpretation of much of the language tends to give an overview of how ones are thinking in a certain manner pertaining to specific subjects and topics, if you're able to actually understand fully the language. Even if you're just a beginner or a novice in certain languages, you're able to understand certain things that other people cannot or don't have the ability to do so when you're able to speak, even at a beginner sense, different languages. So again, we revisit this notion of being linguistically handicapped, or one who is limited in their speaking patterns or their understanding of certain languages other than the language they were born speaking. You find yourself, inadequate at really understanding in a full perspective, in a full outlook on a different culture and how they perceive themselves and how they carry themselves, so to speak, in a manner in which ones are speaking a different language than yourself, if you're, only one who can speak one specific language and that's all that you're able to, of course, interpret or, draw from. So we just put that on the outset on this notion, because when we actually look at the Spanish-speaking countries or the Spanish-speaking peoples that are living in other countries and have to adopt other languages other than what would be known as their native tongue, you seem to find out that there's a duplicity or a multiplicity, and so to speak, if one's are able to speak multiple languages aside from just maybe one or two, you find that they're able to tap into a sense of thinking, a sense of cognizance that is, juxtaposed to whatever governance, statutes, or, ways and means of living, or rhetoric that may come from the country or the place that one might be living in at that time, specifically speaking of a domicile and so on and so forth. So as we know, even here, we have in North America a large percentage of Spanish-speaking descendants. So even in that sense, you have ones who are able to adjust, and even so, quote-unquote, code switch between English and Spanish, whether it be from Mexico or Cuba or Bolivia, Ecuador, or Venezuela, so on and so forth, all of the Latin-speaking countries. Even so to Spain, as though, even there in Europe, there's a different, walk of people. There's a different, tone of voice. There's a different overall perspective of one who speaks English and Spanish. And of course, this stretches out to many other facets of ones who know different specific languages as well. So that takes its toll on how ones tend to live their life. And this is all pertaining to culture as well. As we mentioned, and take that fold also from His Majesty and also our brother Yadin from the LOJS, language is the key to culture. Culture plays a heavy role in the overall makeup of one specifically when they're dealing with their own personality, when they're dealing with their own characteristics. So when you find yourself at a point where you're able to interpret or translate or transliterate certain languages that are foreign to your own, quote unquote, you're able to tap into a different mode of thinking, a different rhetoric, a different doctrine, a different historical reference, a different viewpoint, in seeing it from the inside out instead of the outside in. And so even so, when we look at the Spanish-speaking countries or the Spanish-speaking peoples of that specific descent, we see that they have a very interesting, a very different, and sometimes juxtaposed culture, history, characteristic, or even, just overall makeup of themselves and how they see themselves and how they see the world as their own worldview than ones who only speak English, even so if they're not from the country of England. So this is, an interesting dichotomy that plays itself out in one's everyday life. And so again, just checking that, ones can really, start to look for that in their own day-to-day and, really see things exactly how they are. Now, we tie all of this into our specific vid post here because we, of course, know that Rastafari has a great role to play in the Imperial Ethiopian government, the Imperial Ethiopian kingdom. And seeing so many diverse doctrines coming up at a certain point, even as to a point to where even I have experienced certain ones, I guess you can say fighting against or belittling the importance of learning the language of Ethiopia, or at least learning one language, as though Ethiopia has many languages, and so to speak. I think maybe the last time we checked, there are probably, 83 dialects, and specifically probably, more than 10 to 20 plus languages there in Ethiopia alone. But specifically speaking, the most prevalent are Oromia, is Tigrinya, and also Amharic or Amharic. It, begs the point, even so, in this same scenario plays out on the entire continent of Africa, as you have many different tribes, many different peoples living within certain borders, some mostly, really mostly artificial borders at that point. And, those lines were drawn, as an attempt to exploit the resources of Africa as well as the people. And we see that a lot of this plays out on a mass scale and puts most of the people, especially there on the continent and stretching out to the diaspora, at a very heavy disadvantage. So we even notice and really take a great reception in how His Majesty always conducted himself in certain manners of speech, in certain manners of interviews that may have taken place. You will notice that His Majesty only spoke in Amharic. And I've always have to big up, Anna's sister there at the Light Judah Society, as she has inspired so many works that I have been able to bring forward, especially dealing with the language in the Learn Amharic series. And we'll, of course, have some recordings, of the sister Tehitten Agirma, as well as I, Yohannes, Wolde, Amanuel, just giving a lot more basic learning principles of acquiring, the native tongue of Amharic or Ethiopian Amharic, for ones who are really seeking to learn the language and become fluent in the language. But of course, just starting with the basic principles, we'll have a recording available and probably a small fee for those ones who are really serious about learning the language and, really upping their, literary skills and their linguistical skills in that sense very shortly. But, again, just sticking to the point, we notice that there's a lot of dissension amongst Rastafari, whether it be in the Caribbean or here in the States or, those out in Latin America as well, all the way to the continent, that there's this specific interpretation of Rastafari, but it's solely from a spiritual standpoint. So it's ethereal, so it's really more so in the ethers and not, transpiring and, transporting itself here on the physical realm to where ones are actively pursuing learning the language. And some may even fight against those who actively pursue that endeavor. So we come to a crossroads at this point. We come to a crossroads at the point to where ones are actually seeking to go to Ethiopia. And even some that have done that have begun learning the language and definitely, becoming very fluent in many rights or many circumstances, as though you find yourself seeing that many a Rastafari who may not have ever spoken any other language than maybe Jamaican patois, Caribbean patois, depending on your geographical location, or American English, or even, so the broken English, as though we have spoken here on these North American shores, even so. But, getting into a lot of the language and learning it so that they are able to not only conduct business, but are able to actually function in a community that they weren't born into. So that begs a great point in that, and really bringing about a lot of growth, a lot of progress, slowly but surely on most fronts. But again, a little progress is better than none at all. And even so, just within our own contacts there on the ground, there in Ethiopia, we have been informed that many Rastafari have begun and are becoming very fluent in the Amharic language, and maybe some other languages as well, especially the Oromia, as Shashamani is there, specifically there in the Oromo region. And so ones who are looking to do business, or, of course, just be able to function within a governmental sense, or have a place and, have their say amongst the people as they are seeking to bring forward many programs, many initiatives, many proposals, many projects that can benefit not only the country but the continent as it comes to them and as it presents itself as a manner of an opportunity. They're becoming very fluent in the languages of their surrounding areas, and that's just something that comes about at a time when it's definitely needed. We speak about Rastafari and repatriation, or expatriation as the world would see it, and ones really have to, get out of their feelings and really get into, a lot of different thinking on these notions, because thinking that one can actually excel solely on a spiritual principle, is very infantile itself in one's thinking. So ones have to really come to a notion of the reality that, seeing that what has happened in their past, especially speaking to those of the African diaspora, that the notion of becoming multilingual is essential to your progression, is essential to your thriving. As though we know that many countries had sought to carve up Africa, and so they did, as per the Berlin Conference of the late 1800s, about 1884, 1885 or so, dealing with Cecil Rhodes and those who, of course, conspired against the continent to, of course, extract many resources, people, lands, and, so on and so forth. We know the story. This is nothing that we have to really expound on too much, though we will if need be, for ones to really get a full perspective on that. We find that even so, through the colonial period, the languages of these certain areas of Europe was forced upon much of the continent, and the majority in that sense being French. So even so, for one of the African diaspora here in the Western Hemisphere, and even other places as well, especially Europe and Latin America, we have to come to that realization that much of Africa itself as a continent, speaking of specific countries, they're mostly fluent in French, European French. So how are we able to do business with one if they haven't learned English or haven't sought to learn English, or, just have no affinity or no initiative put forward to them to learn English? Though English has become a very modern language, a language of trade across the world, no matter where you are, you're able to find maybe one or two, or maybe a few ones who are able to speak English, even if it's so with a heavy accent. But the majority of Africa speaks French. And along with that, you have other languages like Portuguese and Spanish in very small pockets, and Arabic. So if you find yourself in Africa and you are at a point to where you're unable to interpret these languages or translate them for yourself, how are you able to do business with people you can't communicate with? That's a very heavy subject to think about. And again, bringing you again to the point of the Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters and the Latino or Ladino communities, they're able to, quote-unquote, code switch to where one is able to transliterate and translate and understand fully the English language, as per some may be born in certain English-speaking countries, but in their households, among certain parts of their communities, they're speaking Spanish. And it's not just a sense of them knowing two languages, but also knowing two modes of thinking, two ways of interpreting things. One may interpret something in Spanish differently than one that may interpret it in English. And that's on a number of subjects to be discussed. And this can all play out on so many levels, not only in the mentality, but the politics, the geography, the overall thinking of one, the culture, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that are needed, even so, as the world continues to play itself out on this stage as we see it. So, all in all, even so, we had a reasoning with our brother. One of the brothers there at the LNC committee, I won't name the brother's name at this point because, we're still, are working on many things, and definitely, just dispelling a lot of the misdirection in the rhetoric, as many ones have come forward at certain times, and, helping to, especially to the best of our ability, to bring forward pertinent information, very important things that will help people, especially those of our affinity, of our bloodline, of our diaspora, to gain, those things which may have been lost. And language being a very, very, very important issue on many fronts. And being able to, move their way through a lot of different overviews and points of view, specifically speaking, on certain instances, especially when dealing with the continent of Africa. So in that sense, and really bringing this home for ones to really get an overall view of where we were really going with this, having that reasoning with the brother from the Law and Constitutional Committee, we spoke on this title of Ras, and this was all pertaining mostly to certain things like name change, name correction, dealing with those things of the law, as though especially dealing with the LNC, or the Law and Constitutional Committee. These are things which we are seeking to present and bring forward certain newsletters, certain articles, all original from our own perspective community, as we have a team of writers there at the Law and Constitutional Committee. And they have, of course, committed themselves to bringing forward some very important and crucial instances for ones to, go from step one all the way to the final step of correcting their names or changing their names in that manner, especially seeking to fulfill themselves in the movement that known of Rastafari. We really had a in-depth reasoning about a lot of issues on titles and names, and as this Western law would show, attributes. So, even so, keeping that in that forefront and really staying on track. We noticed that a lot of ones tend to use this title, Ras. Ras. Ras, in a sense, means head on one front if you were to translate it to the English. But if we were to get actually specific and go into the details of what Ras entails from the Amharic Ethiopian language, it has its affinities and senses and connotations, similarities to one of a field marshal, or even so in a traditional sense to a duke, a governor. Something to really think about in that note. Someone's in a lot of sense. I have to even shout out, my brother Dimmock Warcloud, as even though he has been on a lot of other platforms doing a lot of works, the brother has even visited Ethiopia. Looking forward to going again. Hopefully we can connect. My brother, this is just a shout out to the eye, and I really give thanks for a lot of the eye's works. As many ones as well, because he brought about some very important issues, and it even so led me to evaluate myself and my understanding of the language in certain senses, because he spoke on how many Rastafari tend to hold that title Ras, in incorrect manners at certain points. Sometimes it's not a widely spread thing, but it's a issue to be addressed and brought out, and of course corrected when needed. The title Ras, as I mentioned, is not a name. It's not something that an Ethiopian would name their child, unless that was actually the name that was presented to be used as such. Ras, in the sense, especially in the Ethiopian imperial government, was shown to be a title, given to, again, as I mentioned, a field marshal, a duke, a governor of a certain province. So it's a title, no different than that of a governor, duke, a senator, so on and so forth. This is what Ras actually means. Again, we mentioned that it means head in a literal sense, but again, it has its connotations and similarities to a specific function within a government. And we can speak on many other instances of that as well. Even ones may have heard the title Blattengata. Blattengata is also a title from the imperial Ethiopian government. This literally means a master of youth, or a youth counselor, a prelate of the sovereign. So the sovereign, of course, would be the king or the emperor. In that sort of sense, it's a privacy council amongst certain ones, where this one would be the moderator amongst a certain particular group. And traditionally, in a legal manner, this is, a community leader, a Blatengeta. So again, it takes a certain instance to really evaluate yourself at a certain point and really gain a certain level of knowledge and understanding of certain manners of culture, language, history. These are the, I guess you can say, a trinity, and they are trifold of one really coming to the realization of where their studies are leading them to. And again, we can roll down a lot of these titles, even so, to the specific points. I've even seen, and I can actually attest to this, that certain women, in Rastafari, are those, who are, Rasta affinity wise, or those of, just certain ones just coming in and not really understanding the fullness of what Rastafari entails. It's specifically, especially from the Ethiopian perspective, as per Ras Teferi Mekwanen Wolde Mikael came from Ethiopia. So if ones are very true and are honest in their opinion, Ras Teferi or Rastafari started in Ethiopia, not Jamaica, not even the United States or anywhere else in the world. It started in Ethiopia. So just bringing that to the forefront, we really have to yield at the point that these things are, in spirit and in truth, the facts, pure as they may be. Even so, the title that I use, and it's more so, me at a point seeking to humble myself, because I really didn't feel that I was deserving of a title as Ras, at the point in which I was coming up. So I tend to use that in a sense because I still seek to uphold the premises of the Crown Council. But these are titles which are, of course, supposed to be bestowed upon certain nobility by the Crown Council or by the Crown itself. So even so with Lidj. Lidj is a title of nobility, which is, of course, in the literal sense, I guess you could say, a pejorative of one who is a le'ul or a ras. It's more so given to the children of the imperial Ethiopian government. These are titles which are not used in Ethiopia today because it's not an imperial government that actually adheres to certain principles that the Ethiopian Imperial Crown Council, the Imperial Ethiopian Kingdom, had adhered to from that time. So these titles are, not used. Maybe they're not understood from a certain standpoint. Maybe they're not used in the ways in which they should, but it is what it is at this point. And you have a regime change, or you had regime changes in Ethiopia, and now you have a federal democratic republic of Ethiopia, and this is the government in which is functioning at this moment. So again, this title Lidj is specific to a male child of the nobility. And it even so points out a lot of the instances that have come up, here behind the scenes from certain ones who may have been a part of the community at one point, and now, because of certain circumstances or, certain particulars of understanding that haven't come to the fullness, ones have left the community and they've sought other ways, which is fine. These are things that, ones have to come to for themselves. These are, revelations that ones have to seek out, and walk out for themselves. We don't, hold, a yoke around anyone's neck. We don't shackle anyone to the beliefs that we believe. Ones can believe as they see fit. And this is the manner of free will and choice in the world, and even so specifically to our own spirituality and our way of life. So we, again, I put that on the outset as a disclaimer to ones to, again, seek that which is good for you. that is, the premise of any of our specific, I guess you can say, rendition or lecture or reasoning. Just a plain conversation to anyone, who might come and inquire of what things may be spoken, especially here on this channel and other ones of our own connected and specific community. So we put that forward just for once. And again, here just looking at the specifics of the Amharic Ethiopian language, we notice that there's a specification to male and female. I know that ones will have their own outlook as far as this LGBTQ community and this, I guess you can say, idealism of, whatever it might be and whatever ideas they might be putting forward as having ones be very gender specific or the lack thereof. But here in these ancient cultures, these ancient languages, these ancient cultures, is a very specific interpretation. They're even shown in the language and spreading out to the culture as how ones carry themselves and their own characteristics and how they interpret these things to gender specifics. So even so, with this title Lidj, you have the opposite or the equivalent from the female sense of illegit. So these are things that you come across when studying the language, when actually getting into certain things as such. And this has its own, overall view throughout different languages as well. Other languages seem to be very gender specific. They seem to be very interpretive, making their own interpolations of these languages. These interpolations have their own, I guess you can say, driving force in the sense of being very critical and very forthright in bringing forward a specific ideal. But this is what we tend to find throughout, many cultures, many languages, and many historical standpoints. And putting that forward for ones, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, I've even seen that many women have sought to use the title of Ras, which from an Ethiopic standpoint would be incorrect. And not to, bash or, put ones on blast, as they would say in these times. We really just find that, being specific, these things are just incorrect in their interpretation and their usage. We find certain titles that are very specific toward women as such, and for example, the imabate. And the imabate, of course, brings about its own interpretation, and though and even so with brother Yohannes, I have to thank him for that also, because he gave a more in-depth and more detailed interpretation of the word imabate. Imabate would be also a female descendant of the nobility, or one who is a part of that entire governmental structure, usually literally meaning girl or woman, but even so in a more detailed sense, meaning a woman of a specific house, a woman of a specific governmental function. And its equivalent would be to the Ras. So we put that forward for many ones to actually put into perspective. And again, we mentioned the female equivalent of a Lidj would be a legit. A legit, a female child of the nobility. These are certain nuances and certain specific details about the language, about the culture, about the history, which, go unnoticed because ones don't seem to find that learning the language of what they say that they have a great affinity to seems to be unimportant to them at a certain specific time in which they are trotting throughout Rastafari. And I really personally, on a personal note, think that that really serves as a disappointing notion to ones, because they haven't opened themselves up fully to what they claim that they are walking out. And we know that we are always at different stages, and many other ones are, at a different point and seeing things at a different manner than other ones are at a specific time. So we definitely take notice of that, but at the same time, we really seek to bring about much of the knowledge that seemingly is being overlooked for ones that really are seeking these things. So again, as per tying this in with the name change, name correction, and probably more so another a portion of the Learn Amharic series, we put this forward just for recording because we were thinking a lot on this, and especially having the reasoning with our brother from the LNC, the Law and Constitutional Committee. We sought to bring this out a little more, and hopefully, Jah willing, we'll be able to expound a lot more on these titles, especially the ones of nobility and those bestowed by the crown, which will aid and help ones in their growth and help ones to seek more progress in what they see as the Rastafari movement. So again, we'll just sign out at this point. We know we've been a little long on this video, so we don't want to keep the eye too much. But again, just had to really bring that out for a second, because we are seeking to get more into our geopolitical analysis and our economic analysis of the world stage, so on a worldwide scale, and of course being more specific to our own geographical location, as most of our community is held within the confines of this specific locale or dominion. So again, we'll sign off for this moment, but as always, peace within the heart, home, and the mind. We of course pray that Jah gives the eye strength in this very trying time, as things continue to spiral out of control for ones, and other ones seem to be, just now finding their stride of step. But we pray that Jah blesses and keeps the eye, as always, and, gives you his shalom or his peace, and helps you to excel in whatever endeavor you seek to bring out within yourself and for your family and for those you hold near. And until next time, we'll definitely catch the eye on the next video. This has been Lidj, Yefdi, Yefdeyah, Yohannes, Wolde, Amanuel. Shalom.